Erica from the Miss Babs team, and I'm here to talk a little bit about gauge and how to knit a gauge swatch today. I really like to knit sweaters, and gauge can really make or break a sweater project, giving you a sweater that fits or is too small or too large. So most of your knitting patterns will give you a gauge to get, but you can't assume you're going to get the gauge specified in the pattern, so it's very important to swatch for every project you make. This is one of the biggest problems we run across with folks who don't necessarily swatch before they knit their project, and they can end up with a garment that doesn't fit, or maybe they run out of yarn. When you first start knitting, you might make something like a scarf or a hat, which doesn't necessarily need to fit, but when you start making something like a sweater, you're really going to need to consider your gauge. Even though you're excited to get going on your project, you can, it always says on the pattern, take time to save time, knit a swatch. Some people will always match the needle size given in the pattern, and those folks are really lucky, but most of us may need to go up or down a needle size depending. Your gauge can change depending on what kind of needles you're using, whether you're hanging out at knit night, maybe you've had a glass of wine, or maybe you're at home watching the TV. Can all influence what gauge you get. So you may be wondering, when do I have to measure my gauge? Basically, anytime you're making something that needs to fit, or when you need to be sure you'll have enough yarn to complete your project. Another good thing that gauge influences is the drape of your finished project. So in general, a smaller gauge will use a little less yarn, and a larger gauge will use a little more yarn. If you're working on a pattern like some shawls where you can't easily adjust the yardage, it may really be worth swatching to make sure you don't run out. And this has happened to me. It happens to everybody. Last year I was knitting my Rhinebeck sweater, and I got really excited, and I was really rushing to finish it, and my gauge got tighter and tighter and tighter, and my sweater got smaller and smaller and smaller, and I had to give it to my mom, which, not so bad, love you, Mom, but I didn't get my sweater that year. So let's start by looking at some swatches we've knit on Yowza. And these 5 swatches were all knit using Yowza, but they were all knit on different needle sizes. So our smallest swatch was knit with a size 5 needle, and our largest swatch was knit on a size 9 needle. And as you can see, they get the difference between the smallest and the largest swatch is pretty significant. Both in size, you can see the stitches are a lot smaller or a lot bigger. This swatch is pretty solid, and this swatch has a little bit more drape. One thing we've done here so that we can remember what size needle we used is we've tied some knots in our tails so that we know that this one was knit on a 5, this one has 9 knots, it was knit on a 9. Another way to double check that real quick, or another technique for that, is to use a purl stitch on your swatch to indicate what needle size you used. When we knit a swatch, you want to try and cast on enough stitches so that you have about 4 inches worth of stitches to measure in your swatch. This swatch we've knit a little garter stitch around the outside and some stockinette on the middle. You don't necessarily have to do that. That's kind of a personal taste thing. I recommend measuring your swatch twice. I recommend measuring it first before you've blocked it while it's still on the needles, just to make sure you're kind of in the ballpark, make sure you're close. So we have our ruler here, and sometimes it's nice to grab some T-pins and mark 4 inches across the middle of your swatch so that you don't second guess yourself. And you want to make sure that you're measuring straight across one row of stitches and not crooked up or down. And then all you do is count across 4 inches worth of stitches. And so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, and 22. It's a great idea to write down how many stitches per 4 inches you're getting. I don't trust my memory anymore. I like to write down what needle size I'm using, what yarn, and then right now I've got 22 stitches to 4 inches. And for our block swatch, measuring it is going to be basically the same. Just lay it down flat, and again, you want to mark 4 inches. and count across one row across the center of your swatch. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. And then again, this is our blocked gauge. Your pattern may also call for a row gauge, and you just turn it around and measure it the same way. In patterns that call for both row gauge and stitch gauge, it's generally more important to make sure your stitch gauge is correct. If for some reason the row gauge is more important in your pattern, it's going to tell you that. One thing I like to do when we get new yarns at the studio is I like to test them. So this was what I did with our Woodberry yarn. So I wanted to see how it looked in stockinette stitch, and then I also wanted to see what it was going to look like in some lace patterns. So just to kind of see how the yarn performs. You may also want to try some swatches for testing out stitch patterns. So I was thinking about making a sweater with these kinds of stitch patterns. Or you may also want to see how a variegated yarn works up and just see how the colors play. Or you could also test other different stitch patterns as well. I hope these tips have been helpful, and I hope I've convinced you to make a gauge swatch for your next sweater. Knitting swatches and measuring for gauge can help you to really enjoy some more successful knitting projects, and we really do want you to be successful here at Miss Babs.